Now, looking at the functional organization of the nervous system. Reflex arcs are the basic unit of the nervous system that allow for rapid autonomic responses to stimuli without involving conscious thought. These are involved in sensory pathways providing the afferent input and motor pathways providing the efferent output, mediated with interneurons in the spinal cord through various tracts. The sensory afferent pathways carry information from sensory receptors, so the skin, eyes or ears, to the central nervous system. These pathways involve primary, secondary and tertiary neurons that relay information through the spinal cord or brainstem to the thalamus and then to specific areas of the cerebral cortex for processing. Motor efferent pathways transmit commands from the central nervous system to effectors, muscles and glands. There are two major types of motor pathways: pyramidal tracts, direct motor pathways with corticospinal tracts that control voluntary movements of skeletal muscle, and extrapyramidal tracts, indirect motor pathways that regulate posture, balance, coordination of voluntary movements, so for example the reticulospinal and vestibulospinal tracts. Let's look at some of the sensory receptors that feed some of these sensory afferent inputs. Sensory receptors are specialized structures that detect environmental changes and convert them into electrical signals. They can be classified based on the type of stimulus they detect. Mechanoreceptors detect mechanical pressure or deformation, for example tactile corpuscles in the skin. Thermoreceptors respond to temperature changes, for example Krauss and bulbs. Nociceptors detect pain or noxious stimuli, and these are usually free nerve endings. Proprioceptors sense the position and movement of the body, or muscle spindles, Golgi tendon. Proprioceptors sense the position and movement of the body, such as muscle spindles or Golgi tendon organs. Sensory neurons are formed of primary, secondary, and tertiary neurons. Primary neurons are the first order neurons that receive sensory stimuli from the receptors and transmit them to the spinal cord or brainstem. Their cell bodies are located in the dorsal root ganglia for spinal nerves or cranial nerve ganglia for cranial nerves. Secondary sensory neurons are neurons located in the spinal cord or brainstem. They receive inputs from the primary sensory neurons and relay the information to the thalamus or other higher processing centers in the CNS. They typically decussate, cross to the opposite side before ascending. Tertiary neurons, finally located in the thalamus, receive these sensory inputs and relay sensory information to the primary sensory cortex in the cerebrum for conscious perception of sensory stimuli. Now, let's break down and delve deeper into the major sensory pathways. First up, we have the dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway, which functions to carry fine touch, vibration, and proprioceptive information. Primary neurons enter the spinal cord and ascend ipsilaterally to the dorsal columns. Now, let's delve deeper into some of the major sensory pathways. First up, the dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway, which functions to carry fine touch, vibration, and proprioceptive information. Primary neurons enter the spinal cord and ascend ipsilaterally to the dorsal columns, fasciculus cuneatus and fasciculus gracilis. They synapse into the medulla oblongata. Secondary neurons cross to the contralateral side and ascend to the thalamus via the medial lemniscus. Tertiary neurons project from the thalamus to the primary somatosensory cortex. The spinothalamic tract transmits pain, temperature, and crude touch. Primary neurons enter the spinal cord and synapse with sensory neurons in the dorsal horn. Sensory neurons cross to the contralateral side and ascend to the thalamus via the spinothalamic tract. Tertiary neurons project from the thalamus to the primary somatosensory cortex. The trigeminal pathway conveys sensory information from the face. Sensory information from the face is carried by the trigeminal nerve, or cranial nerve 5. The primary neuron of cranial nerve 5 synapses into the trigeminal sensory nuclei of the brainstem. Sensory neurons cross to the contralateral side and ascend to the thalamus, where tertiary neurons project to the thalamus from the thalamus to the primary somatosensory cortex. Finally, pathways in the peripheral nervous system, which are responsible for transmitting commands to the CNS from the CNS to skeletal muscles. These pathways include first an upper motor neuron and then a lower motor neuron. Upper motor neurons originate in the motor cortex of the cerebrum or brainstem and project to the spinal cord or brainstem. Upper motor neurons control voluntary movements and modulate the activity of lower motor neurons, which are located in the anterior horn of the spinal cord or cranial nerve nuclei in the brainstem. They directly innervate skeletal muscles and execute motor commands from upper motor neurons, resulting in muscle contraction. The major motor pathways involves the corticospinal tract, which is the main pathway for voluntary motor control. Upper motor neurons originate in the primary motor cortex and descend through the internal capsule, cerebral peduncles. Upper motor neurons originate in the primary motor cortex and descend through the internal capsule, cerebral peduncles, and medullary pyramids. Most fibers decussate at the level of the medulla oblongata. Fibers descend through the lateral corticospinal tract and synapse with lower motor neurons in the anterior horn of the spinal cord, where the lower motor neurons project to skeletal muscles. Extrapyramidal tracts function to modulate motor control and influence posture and muscle tone. The components of these are rubrospinal tracts, originating in the red nucleus of the midbrain, controlling upper limb movements. Vestibulospinal tract originates in the vestibular nuclei and helps maintain balance and posture. Reticulospinal tract originates in the reticular formation and modulates muscle tone and reflexes. And finally, tectospinal tract originates in the superior collicles and coordinates head and eye movements. Here we have broken down the structure and function of both the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. In the central nervous system, we focused on the different lobes of the brain and more specific networks within them, such as the limbic system. We also focused on the individual neurons themselves and glial cells, and discussed the methods by which the brain remodels itself through synaptic plasticity. In the peripheral nervous system, we broke it down into the somatosensory, into the somatic and autonomic nervous systems, with the different autonomic nervous system subtypes of parasympathetic, sympathetic, and enteric, and their each individual functions. Finally, we expanded on some of the motor and sensory paths within the peripheral nervous system. Thank you for tuning in into our latest video on the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system, structure and function of the overall nervous system, and please make sure to check out our further video at the neuromuscular junction, and please stay notified for any new videos coming out where we will discuss the development with clinical links to important nervous conditions, and finally some of the main diseases and manifestations of symptoms within the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system, and some targeted therapies towards those. So thank you again for tuning in, and stay notified for big things to come.